Realizing the Intifada, just do it after the session. You can harangue Jake as much as you want, just not on my dime, okay?
Thank you, Fareed.
So welcome. It's a huge pleasure to have an old friend, Jake Sullivan, here. Jake has worked in the last 2 Democratic administrations. He was President Biden's national security advisor. I think within the world of sort of, international relations, policy wonks, Jake is regarded as, I would say the prodigy who then became the superstar. Hillary Clinton once called him a once-in-a-generation talent, and I think that's basically right. And I think anyone who has worked with him has left with a feeling of really having been a privilege to work with him. You'll see in a second just how focused and analytic and super smart he is. So, Jake, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. My brother heard that comment about talent and was like, that's total BS. He's like, I'm in your generation, okay? So, anyway.
Well, what was it? Churchill said, "No man is a hero to his valet." Not that you're. I'm
going to tell my brother that. Yeah.
Yeah, that would add insult to injury to Tom. All right, we're going to start. Jake Sullivan, pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me.
What was your reaction to Donald Trump deciding to use American military power in the way he did over the last few days?
Well, first, we could see this building up, in part because over the course of 2024, Iran was degraded to its weakest point since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. It had lost its main proxy, Hezbollah. It had lost its main client state, Assad, Syria. It had lost its air defenses. And twice in 2024, it tried to attack Israel directly with missiles. And twice, with the support and direct help of the United States, Israel rendered those attacks totally ineffective. So Iran was basically exposed, which created the possibility, in my view, for one of 2 outcomes. Either a military strike that Iran couldn't really respond to, or a deal that could lock in Iran for the long term and put a box and a lid on its nuclear program. My main reaction coming out of these strikes is the question that gets asked so often in foreign policy. Okay, then what? And the then what for me is that sitting here today, after American military pilots conducted an operation with skill and effectiveness, we still need a deal. Because Iran still has, it appears, stockpiles of enriched uranium, still has centrifuge capacity, even if the installed centrifuge capacity has been destroyed or damaged or who knows what, and still has know-how, and therefore still has the possibility of reconstituting its program. And let me add also, Iran right now is not allowing the International Atomic Energy Agency to go to any of these sites. So the verification we had before, or we'd have under a deal, we don't currently have. So I would say that even though right now you can clearly look at the Iranian nuclear program and see it's been set back, the threat of the Iranian nuclear program has not been comprehensively dealt with and can only be comprehensively dealt with if we can get a long-term deal that locks Iran's nuclear program in a box so that they can never get a nuclear weapon.
There's a lot to unpack there, so I want to start with what you said. Wouldn't it be fair to say that we were all surprised by how weak Iran and its proxies were? And I mean by all, even the Israelis, I think, were surprised when they first went after Hezbollah. And remember, they went after Hezbollah because their pagers were beginning to get exposed because of a software update. And so they decided, okay, let's go. And Hezbollah collapses. And then they strike Iran, and Iran has, as you said, barely any ability to strike back. They go after Syria, and the Syrian regime collapses for many reasons. It feels like this was this something that all of us didn't realize just how weak and dysfunctional this axis of resistance that Iran had built up was.
You know, one thing that I've reflected on over the course of my 4 years as National Security Advisor is there's been more than one instance where I think we've overestimated the military capacity of our adversaries.
Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein.
Russia, right. Just before Ukraine. right? We thought Kyiv had fallen a week because of the Russian military juggernaut, and Russia was exposed as having basically a corrupt and ineffectual army. And it certainly didn't hurt that you had a very brave Ukrainian army standing athwart them to stop them from taking Kyiv and taking over Ukraine. And yes, I think the view from across the professional class of national security decision makers, including intelligence and uniformed military professionals, was that Iran and its proxies had more juice than it turns out that they had. But it was pretty apparent by October of last year, when Hezbollah essentially had to sue for peace with Israel, and when Iran didn't even respond to Israel striking and taking out its air defenses and proclaiming that to the world, that Iran was in a very weakened state. And in fact, you wrote a column a few weeks after that, late last year or early this year, basically saying, hey, look at America's adversaries, including Iran. They are in a very weakened state. So I'm less surprised in the short term, just of what happened over the last 2 weeks. But over the stretch of it, it definitely is a different level of capacity than we had factored in when we were making our decisions over the course of multiple administrations, including, frankly, the Trump administration the first time around.
Talk to me about Bibi Netanyahu. This is a guy you dealt with personally, constantly. It feels to me like people used to always say, he's very canny, very wily, but he's cautious. He doesn't take crazy risks. The reporting I have is that the IDF initially wanted to go north to Hezbollah after the October 7th attacks. Bibi was cautious. What do you think happened? Because he is really, he took a very big gamble here, that he was going to go after all these forces and that they were all going to collapse. What changed his calculus, do you think?
I think he looked at the picture of what unfolded last year over 2024. Hezbollah could no longer effectively threaten Israeli cities. Iran was reeling from the loss of Assad. And then when Iran tried to throw its best punches at Israel, with critical aid, direct military support from the United States, basically defeated those attacks. And then Israel was able to reach out and touch Iran quite effectively. So I think he looked at all of that. And then I think there was a second factor, which is that over the course of several years, the military and intelligence enterprise in Israel has been less enthusiastic about the military option than some of the political types. That changed last year. So there was a chorus of voices from across his national security establishment saying, this is something we can do and we should do. And that was true from the IDF, it was true from the Mossad, it was true from others, and I think that had an impact on him as well. But one thing I will say is Israel has shown time and time again under Prime Minister Netanyahu, they can conduct military operations with effectiveness, indeed with panache, as they have done in Lebanon and in Iran. But they also sometimes have difficulty connecting those military actions to a clear strategic endgame that is sustainable. And I am worried in the Iran case, as I am gravely alarmed in the Gaza case, that they are not aiming towards a clear and sustainable endgame. And I think that's why U.S. policy has to be clear-eyed. We've seen what's happened over the last 12 days. Now we need to turn to getting a diplomatic solution that can sustain for the long term. And Israel may not want to go along with that, but I think President Trump would be right to press for that.
So let me ask you very simply, on the basis of having looked at this intelligence very carefully over the last 4 years, could Iran build nuclear weapons on a relatively fast timeline underground over the next year?
So I'm going to start with the caveat, because any good intelligence person will always start with the caveat. And my caveat is that we still need to get the full battle damage assessment of what happened. And we need it to be unfiltered from political interference. We just need the straight dope from the American intelligence community and, frankly, from the Israeli intelligence community. But based on what I've seen so far, it is probable that Iran still retains on its territory some stockpiles of enriched uranium, still retains centrifuges and the capacity to build more of them. Much of that was destroyed, but probably not all of it, and still retains the know-how. So if they woke up tomorrow and said, we are going for it, it's not implausible to me that a crash military program could be conducted in as little as a year. I've heard from some Israelis who say 2 or 3 years. You saw this one DAA report that said as short as 6 months. But it's going to be in that zone if they went for it. Now, what the Israelis would say is they won't. They won't go for it because now they've been so rocked back on their heels, they know that if they try, we'll come back. But the problem is that will leave us in a weird limbo where Iran has this capability and maybe they go deep underground and try to do it. And the answer may have to be just constant, persistent military strikes to ensure they don't do it. That is not the best outcome. The best outcome, as I've said, would be a deal. And I'll make one more point. We tend to hold the outcome of military action to a much lower standard than the outcome of a diplomatic negotiation. What do I mean by that? If I came to you and said, Fareed, I've got a deal with the Iranians. They're not going to build a nuclear weapon. And you said to me, well, did you get all their enriched uranium? I said, no, I think it's buried, but I'm not sure. Well, did you get all their centrifuges? No, not all of them. Are the inspectors there? Not right now, but hopefully we'll get them back. That's the current situation. If I told you that was the deal we had struck with the Iranians, you said it's a terrible deal. And so, from my perspective, we need to make sure we keep our eye on the prize, which is a long-term cutoff of any pathway to a nuclear weapon in Iran. And I continue to believe that that will require a diplomatic agreement that resolves all of those questions that currently don't have completely decisive answers.
What do you think President Trump's role in it going forward should be? What should he be trying to do? Because as you pointed out, the Israelis don't really think they need a deal. They think they can essentially just keep going in and periodically bombing the Iranians if they see something that seems suspicious.
Right. I think that is, from the American national security interest, that kind of strategic limbo is basically a source of instability and uncertainty and risk. And it's not necessary, because I believe a deal is available. I believe the Iranians would come to the table and do a serious agreement that would have verification, that would deal with the stockpile, that would deal with all the issues that the first Iran nuclear deal dealt with. And by the way, we're talking right now about a year, 2 years, 3 years. The JCPOA was 15 years, okay? So from the U.S. perspective, it is clear that getting back to the table and trying to do an agreement makes sense. We hear some soundings from the administration they're interested in doing that, others maybe less so. And then the other thing I think President Trump should do, and I think he may be looking at this and thinking he will, is use this moment, this opportunity, to end the war in Gaza and to move towards a two-state solution and to move towards a different vision for the region and really seize an opportunity that I think is there to bring real pressure to bear on Israel to come along in a regional diplomatic effort that is not going to be easy by any stretch, but should be the focus of U.S. policy at this point.
Let me ask you about Gaza, but starting with something that you must get asked a lot and controversy swirls. The Biden administration is accused by many people of not having done enough to end a really horrific war in Gaza in which thousands and thousands of innocent Palestinians seem to have died. What is your answer to that criticism?
Well, first, what is happening in Gaza today and what has happened since October 7th has been a god-awful tragedy. It was a tragedy on October 7th when we witnessed, the world witnessed, the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, and it's been a tragedy every day since. A tragedy of innocent people in Gaza, innocent Palestinians being killed, a tragedy of people being denied basic food and medicine, a tragedy of hostages being held and their families not knowing whether they're going to ever see them again. And that's, if you work on these issues as a human being, as someone who has a beating heart, you have to feel the weight of that. And I felt the weight of that every day in office. I feel and carry the weight of that still. And I ask the question, What else, what more could we have done? And I'm open to a robust and good faith debate with people who have different views. One of the main arguments people made was you should cut off weapons to Israel. We did stop sending them 2,000-pound bombs, which we regarded as especially destructive of civilians without being proportional in terms of their military targets. But one of the challenges we faced last year in cutting off arms generally to Israel wasn't just fighting in Gaza. It was being attacked by Hezbollah, by Syrian militias, by Iraqi militias, by the Houthis, and by Iran itself. And so when you're sitting in the Situation Room, you have to contend with that and thinking, are we going to essentially end or sever or suspend our military relationship with Israel or stop providing them the means to defend themselves? But I will keep asking myself the question of whether there was more we could do. I would just say one more thing that I think is important, which is the argument that the Biden administration did not have an impact on Israeli decision-making with respect to Gaza, I think comes under real pressure when you look at the last 4 months and the humanitarian situation. We went through weeks and weeks this year under President Trump where there was a complete siege of Gaza. No food was getting in, nothing. I worked every day as National Security Advisor alongside our team with Secretary Blinken and others to push, cajole, and demand from the Israelis the opening of crossings, the movement of humanitarian assistance, and it was never enough, but I do believe that we staved off a famine that had long been predicted. And the difference between that and what we saw the last few months is the difference between an administration that actually was trying to work to improve the lives of the Palestinian people, even in these god-awful and horrific circumstances.
The argument people make is that Bibi played you guys. Bibi Netanyahu knew that at the end of the day, you could bluster, you could say things, but you wouldn't cut off the aid, and so he could essentially ignore many of your entreaties.
Well, first, as I just mentioned, when it came to the humanitarian assistance, President Biden went to Israel a few days after October 7th, and as he was flying in, the position of the Israeli government was 0, 0, 0. Nothing is going in, nothing. No crossings, no food. And we had to press and push and take really decisive action from the top to change that circumstance, to get food and humanitarian assistance into Gaza. And I believe that we did have an impact in a significant way on that. So he could not fully ignore the United States. But as I said earlier, the United States was in a challenging position when it came to the question of how do you apply leverage with respect to a friend who is under attack from multiple directions all at once. That's a tough circumstance. And that is what we contended with. And those who say, well, you should have just gone ahead and done it. I understand that argument. My personal view is that it is a very challenging thing to walk away from a friend in to that significant a dimension when they are facing this level of attack from this many different directions.
When you talk about the Israeli demand of 0, 0, 0, or you point out that right now there were several weeks where essentially nothing got in, what do you think is going on? What is it? What is? I think we all have underestimated the degree to which October 7th really changed the Israeli psyche. Do you think there is a desire for almost a kind of collective revenge on the people of Gaza?
Look, I think Israeli society is complex. Obviously, it's a raucous democracy with a lot of views, and I'm sure there are people in Israel. In fact, there are leaders in Israel who have voiced that view. And it's odious, and it's totally criminal, that view that just says collective punishment, we can do these things. But the main line, I believe, of Israeli policy from the beginning was so focused on we just can't have Hamas gain anything from this, gain money from it, or get the supplies to keep running their war against us, that they let that operational decision kind of cloud their judgment about aid getting to innocent people.
Let me ask you about another theater which you were deeply involved in, Russia-Ukraine. Does it look to you like the Russians have been gaining ground over the last few months in Ukraine?
They have been gaining ground very incrementally, at unbelievable cost. But they have been chipping away at that front line in the east, day by day, hour by hour, week by week, and President Putin seems determined to try to continue to do that. Now, the Ukrainians have been brilliant in figuring out how to adapt their defenses to really slow that Russian advance to an absolute grind, and a costly grind at that. And they've done so with this combination of just sheer grit and technical brilliance. This drone program that they have developed, which has, to a significant extent, replaced artillery as the main mode of defense on the battlefield. And I'm very proud that the United States, frankly, that the National Security Council, my team, worked from the early days to help invest in and build up the Ukrainian drone program so that it would be in a position to be resourced and to be able to deliver this kind of impact on the battlefield. But President Putin's sitting there right now and saying, I don't really have an American president who's fully supporting the Ukrainians. I don't have an American president who's turning up the heat on me economically. And I'm prepared to continue to pay this cost in lives because I don't care about how many Russians die. So he seems determined to continue this war. And I think the right answer for the United States is to surge more support to the Ukrainians and to dial up the pressure on the Russians. And that if we did that, it would send a powerful signal to Putin. The time is ultimately not on his side, and that could get a better deal at the negotiating table that could lead to a just and sustainable peace. That is what I believe President Trump should do. And he sometimes walks up to that line. In fact, just as recently as this week, he spoke about Putin as being the challenge, the problem, and he never quite puts his money where his mouth is when it comes to Vladimir Putin. I don't know why that is, but I think now he should. And he should come in behind the Ukrainians in a big way, and the Europeans would be right there alongside him.
One of your predecessors, General McMaster, who I think was Trump's national security advisor in the first term for about a year, said in his memoirs that after working a year with Donald Trump every day, the one thing I could never figure out was why he was so favorably inclined towards Russia and Putin. Do you have a theory?
I actually don't have a theory, and I know it's kind of a lame answer, but yeah, someone said yeah, but what is demonstrably, manifestly true is that President Trump is prepared to stick it to friends. He's prepared to stick it to foes. He's prepared to stick it to competitors like Xi Jinping, 145% tariffs. But he's never prepared to stick it to Vladimir Putin. When he put out his tariffs, almost every country in the world got tariffs. Lesotho got tariffs. Ukraine got tariffs. Russia did not get tariffs. So, do you have a theory?
No. I mean, it is puzzling. The tariff case is fascinating, right? Because when asked, I think either he or one of his aides said, well, it's because we don't import anything from them because there's sanctions on. But actually, we import a lot more from Russia than from Lesotho. In fact, we import more from Russia than pretty much all of Africa, I think, if you take energy exports out. So, it has been one of the central puzzles. Even in the 2 weeks ago, he was asked, do you think it's time to put sanctions on Russia? And he said, yeah, I think it's time to put sanctions on Russia and Ukraine. So there's something there where one piece of it, I wonder, this is not, he's a creature of we forget he's 78, 79 years old. He's a creature of the Cold War. I think he thinks of Russia in these very grand, elevated terms that he's going to make a deal. It's something like Kennedy meeting Khrushchev, Nixon meeting Brezhnev, and Trump meeting Putin. The truth is, Russia is a dysfunctional, bankrupt economy. I mean, it's smaller than the Netherlands. I would guess in 5 years, the Polish economy might be bigger than the Russian economy. If we were to actually get our act together, in 10 or 15 years, the Ukrainian economy could be bigger than the Russian economy. But I think he has this fantasy about Russia. Anyway, that's the That's the above board explanation. There are many others, as you know.
But you see how I did that, got the question back over to him. So it's,
So when you were a national security advisor, you gave a couple of speeches and then put in place a bunch of policies which were designed to help bring manufacturing back to the United States. Donald Trump and his team say that is the central focus of what they want to do. And they've put in place a whole bunch of policies, very different from yours, and largely rolled back a lot of your policies. Do you think they're doing the right thing?
Well, first, I want to just slightly amend what our policy thrust was, bring manufacturing back to the U.S. Our focus was on being able to build in this country in strategic sectors that were going to define the future. Chips, clean energy, battery technology, critical ingredients for biotechnology. And our concept was, one, yes, in fact, Americans ought to be able to produce these cutting-edge things just like everybody else, and we make no bones about that. Two, we should not be reliant on any other country in the world. We don't have to make it all here, but we should have the capacity to make it. And three, I have a deep belief that a country that loses its capacity to build erodes its capacity to innovate, that there's a feedback loop. And doing the innovation here and then all of the production over there is a net negative for the United States. I think President Trump has a much more blunt force view, which is just manufacturing jobs, whether it's assembling iPhones or assembling 3-nanometer chips, is just the same. Bring it all back. And I think that it's the leap from the targeted, the specific, the high-tech, to this broad view of everything should be made in America and we should buy nothing from anywhere else, that I think is where the conceptual error, the significant conceptual error comes in.
But there's also a big difference where you essentially, along the lines you were describing, went for industrial policy, try to help these companies, give them the financing they may need, the early contracts they may need. Whereas Trump, it's almost all tariffs. What do you think of the tariffs?
I think these broad-based tariffs that are just applied not to be a targeted countermeasure against a specific economic or national security harm, but are just, here's 10% for everybody, here's 50% for everybody. These essentially are a tax on the middle class. They raise prices. And it's very hard to find economists, you can find one or two here or there, who would say they're actually going to achieve the ultimate objective of bringing back the kind of manufacturing that President Trump wants to bring back. So I do not see this strategy leading to success. And furthermore, President Trump entered a trade war with China, escalated it, China held firm, pushed back, and President Trump backed off. And I think that signal of the willingness to blink is a very negative signal in what is an intense geopolitical competition with China. So the other factor of slapping on these tariffs, then daring other countries to react and getting into a back and forth with friend and competitor alike, I think also just creates a huge number of risks that go way beyond just the economic consequences. And we're seeing that play out in real time right now.
Do you think under President Trump, you are seeing a real withdrawal of America's support for its closest allies? I ask this because I now read in Australia, people are worried that the deal that you guys negotiated for nuclear subs, they're not going to get because it's not going to quite happen. You know that the Europeans, the Germans, are worried that the Americans will not protect Germany, so maybe they need British and French nuclear weapons. To what extent, because of the chaos that Trump kind of creates, and as you say, the various things he says, depending on whether it's Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday, how much of that is real and worrisome, and how much of that is noise that we should look through?
Well, just in the last few days, we had President Trump at the NATO summit saying, I came into it not really wanting to be here, but now I think NATO is pretty great. So you never know on any given day exactly what his view is going to be. But here's how I measure this. When I was National Security Advisor, we worked tirelessly with our allies in Europe and in Asia to come up with a common strategy to de-risk from China, to not be overly strategically dependent on China in critical areas, to push back together on China economic abuses, and to be sure that we had a common strategy in that competition. De-risking from China became the watchword of the US, of Europe, of Japan, Korea, Australia, others. Today, the main conversation happening in Europe and in parts of Asia as well is we need to de-risk from the United States. And this is just a terrible tragedy. It is an absolute strategic own goal. It is something that we have done to ourselves, and it points up to me a deeper problem, which you've actually written about extremely compellingly, which is if you think about the core strategic advantages of the United States, what are the things that really give us the capacity to lead, to solve problems, and to deliver for our people? It's a few things. It's the ability to attract talent from around the world. Lee Kuan Yew famously said, China can count on 1 billion people, the United States can count on the talents of 7 billion people, because we can get the best and the brightest from everywhere. It is a unique innovation ecosystem that's a three-legged stool of government-funded basic research, higher education, and the private sector, and he's kicking out 2 legs of that stool. It is confidence in our capital markets, in our dollar, and he's throwing up questions about that. It's our alliances, which Russia and China would kill for, and the Chinese are looking at how we're playing our alliances and saying, hey, you're doing our work for us. And then, of course, underneath it all is the basic bedrock of rule of law in our Constitution. So we could talk about Iran policy or China policy or Russia policy or anything else, but at the end of the day, my real concern with where we are going is the way in which America's core advantages are being eroded by choice. And I think that we will end up paying the price for this if we don't do something to reverse course very fast. And that's the clarion call I think that we all need to make on behalf of this country that we all love, that we need to stand by these fundamental attributes because they are what truly make us great.
All right, let's open it up to questions. Sir, at the back there. Yeah. Let us get a mic to you.
So here you're talking about, and you know, in our democracy, administrations change every 4 or 8 years. So policies change every 4 or 8 years. So how does Iran policy, how does all these policies transform all these different times of changes in administration? What you're talking about is different what's happening today. What happened with JCPOA 15 years ago is different than the policy today. And the governments you're dealing with are long-term. Iran has been in for 36 years. China is going to be in for a long period of time. They cannot wait what we're doing to our policies or our leaders change. How do we transcend all these periods of time?
It's a great question, and it's something that we have to acknowledge and recognize is a challenge that any democracy has compared to an authoritarian regime. Now, we have huge advantages they don't have. We have, I think, a much greater capacity for accountability and self-correction, for innovation. So you take the challenges with all of the huge benefits, but it's not just generically how does a change in administration affect any given democracy. It's how extreme these swings are getting in the United States. And there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the key ones is this old adage that politics stops at the water's edge has been completely lost. We have politicized everything about our foreign policy and national security, and I think that has been to our strategic detriment. I think getting back to a notion where we try to take down the heat and bring some more light to the overall conversation about how we are engaging in the world would be very valuable. It doesn't mean you can't have robust criticism. I've offered some from this stage, but we should do it in a way where we're not just trying to tear each other down. And I think that that's really been a change in the last 15, 20 years. This level of politicization of everything in the foreign policy and national security realm. And I think we would do well. It's not going to mean that there aren't going to be divergences in policy, and the JCPOA is a good example of one of those. But it's a way to manage that more effectively so that at least for some of the core, the really fundamental things, you can keep the administration running along a common track. And I'll give you an example of a policy. You know, I spent a lot of time in the transition working closely with the incoming administration, because I really felt it was my job to ensure a smooth handoff and a smooth passing of the baton, and have them set up for as much success as possible on behalf of this country. And one of the areas that we talked a lot about was semiconductor export controls vis-a-vis China. And actually, in the early months, the Trump administration has taken some steps to advance that policy. Will that continue or not? I don't know. But what I can say is that practitioners who are, transitioning in and out have to look at what the previous administration did and not just always say, we got to just throw it all out because those guys were a bunch of bums. You got to think and say, what are the elements that we should really double down on and continue, even in cases where we might have modest policy objections? Fareed mentioned AUKUS. Walking away from AUKUS at this point would be a terrible mistake, and I still believe we're not going to do that because it would be such a manifest mistake. But it's that kind of thing that I think we need to see a consistent and steady engagement on from administration to administration. And then the last point I'd make is that the strength of our national security enterprise are not the guys who come in and out every few years. It's the professionals in our military or intelligence community, our diplomatic service, our foreign aid service, across the board. Decimating or politicizing or denigrating those people will not help with any form of continuity over the long term. So I think we should definitely knock that off.
Yeah.
I'm curious your thoughts about this administration's two forms of approaches to the world: the isolationist view that the vice president perhaps represents, and the fact that the Trump administration actually took action against Iran. So did you see one win out over the other, or do you see that there will be more battles between those two sides?
I do think it's interesting that within the right, and it's true on the left as well, that there is a real divide over America's role in the world, especially when it comes to military action. And we saw that play out in living color in the Tucker Carlson, Ted Cruz back and forth, which really kind of typified how there is an element of the MAGA movement that is deeply against any form of military action. But I actually don't like quoting myself, but I'm about to anyway, I guess. Wrote a piece back in 2019 in The Atlantic where the case I was making is Trump has never been an isolationist. He is an aggressive unilateralist. He believes in acting in the world. He just believes in acting alone, not through multilateral institutions, not through alliances. And I believe that actually the Iran case is an example of that. Now, the one thing that was definitely true of the first Trump administration, was true of the Trump campaign, and was true of the early months of this administration, was that he always said, I don't want to get involved in any military conflicts. I'll be an aggressive unilateralist on tariffs or other forms of pressure and coercion. I'll attack terrorists like Baghdadi, but directly engaging in a state-to-state military conflict, that was something he didn't do in the first term, initiate. And he indicated in the first few months when he was doing the Iran negotiations, he didn't want to do it now. Something flipped there. I think what flipped is basically the Israelis were having great success, and President Trump said, I'd like to be a part of that. From my perspective, this is not deeply inconsistent with his overall worldview, but it does remove a restraint that had previously been there, which is he doesn't really want to use military force a lot. So it raises a question about the next 3.5 years, whether now he will think, hey, going and taking these bombing runs in other countries can be a good thing. And that's something we're going to have to watch out for.
The B-2 bomber is, in a way, the ultimate expression of this kind of American unilateralism. The plane takes off from Missouri, never touches any foreign land, never needs no allies' approval is needed, nothing. Goes, delivers its target, is back in Missouri. I mean, it's an extraordinary expression of American power, but it represents that kind of unilateralism. Ma'am. No, so that everyone else can hear, yeah. And if you can just make it short, so
yes,
we can get.
I hate to put you on the spot because I'm a big supporter of you and your former administration, but could you please speak to this auto pen ridiculous conspiracy theory that's going on now about President Biden?
Were you actually running the administration and then secretly finding auto pens to get Biden to sign?
I will tell you, I served as President Biden's national security advisor from the first day of the administration to the last day of the administration. And I saw him from the first day to the last day discharging his duties as commander-in-chief and making very tough calls. I mentioned earlier these 2 Iranian attacks on Israel. One of them took place in October of 2024. And President Biden was at the head of the table in the Situation Room with his military and intelligence leadership, with Secretary Blinken's National Security Council team. And on the screen was Eric Kurilla, the commander of CENTCOM. And President Biden was directing and basically giving out the direction for the United States to enter that defense of Israel and have American ships and American planes and American guys on the ground with the THAAD missile system shooting down Iranian projectiles. And I use that just as an example, so I'm not just saying some generic words. That's what I saw, and I saw it when he was making decisions on everything. And this idea that it was outsourced to an autopan and that he wasn't making the calls right down to the last day when he was working to get that ceasefire and hostage deal in place before he walked out the door. That's the president that I dealt with for the 4 years, and I was extremely proud to serve him and extremely proud to serve in this administration. And I think when we passed off the baton to the incoming administration, our alliances were as strong as they had been in a very long time. Our enemies, as we discussed, were weaker. When we came into the administration, all the talk was about what year is China going to surpass the United States. When we left the administration, the conventional wisdom was China may never surpass the United States. When we came into the administration, it was how much is China going to beat us in AI? When we left the administration, it was how far behind is China in AI? Is it just a little behind or further behind? And for the first time since 2001, the United States was not at war. And so, and then you look at what we were handing off in terms of the economy. It was humming. We were reversing the slide in our defense industrial base. I think we passed off a good hand to the incoming administration. And I worry a lot of that has gotten obscured in this conversation, much of which has gotten very much clouded in political rhetoric. I can't speak to anyone else's experience. I can only speak to my own, and that's my experience.
At the back there. Ma'am, yeah. Yes, exactly.
Hello. I'm curious if, given all of what we've seen with the flip-flop back and forth with Iran, and that we were going to make a deal, then we secretly kind of jumped on and then bombed them, and then we're like, oh, well, let's make a deal again. How honestly that folks are incentivized to make deals with us, given that it feels like the only protection that you can have from us doing our way is to have nuclear weapons?
Look, I do think when you talk about taking military action of this kind, you do have to think not just about the near-term risks, but about the very long tail. What will this action mean in terms of Iran's calculus with respect to getting a nuclear weapon? How will this look 5 or 10 years from now? Those are open questions and very good questions, and I'm glad you asked it. I had firsthand experience with having to contend with this because, of course, President Obama did the JCPOA. President Trump pulled out of the JCPOA. President Biden comes into office, and we try to go back to renegotiate. And, of course, it's more difficult to renegotiate a deal that you've just pulled out of. And we found that experience extremely hard in 2021 and 22, and we're not actually able to consummate a deal that reached a level of satisfaction that we thought we could get Iran's program in a box, and that was partly because of this question of credibility. And I think that will be an ongoing question. But credibility is one half of the equation. The other half of the equation is leverage. And the United States has had and does have leverage. We have sanctions on. We've also shown we have a credible military threat. And so a diplomatic agreement, in my view, is achievable if we engage in a serious way and drive to a deal that can stay in place for a very long time and does not put us in a position where we have to constantly be resorting to the military tool to try to deal with something that can demonstrably be dealt with through diplomacy.
So at the back there, yeah. Trying to do affirmative action for the young over here.
Thank you, gentlemen. Jake, today there are more than 110 active armed conflicts involving 55 states and 70 non-state armed groups. How can coming generations face the complications of increased conflicts? And Fareed, do Americans possess the social skills to confront today's pluralism?
To confront
To confront today's pluralism.
It's a great question.
After you.
There are present in the world today several accelerants of conflict. I know it's not popular in some quarters to say this, but yes, climate is an accelerant of conflict because it's causing resource scarcity, it's forcing migration, it's exacerbating tensions in a lot of parts of the world. Technology is an exacerbator of conflict. We are seeing the democratization of lethal technology in ways that are both inspiring when you see what Ukraine did to Russia recently, and deeply alarming when you see the fact that the Houthis in a cave can slap together a very precise long-range missile or drone and hit a precise spot 2,000 kilometers away in Israel with it. And more groups are going to be able to possess more potency, more precision, and more range in the years ahead. So that is a big exacerbator of conflict. And then you have the fraying of the post-Cold War order and the institutions that were designed and meant to mitigate conflict. And I'm only naming a few, there are many more. So to me, it's getting at the heart of what those drivers of conflict are and trying to reduce the potency of those drivers that then can help you deal with the overall level of conflict. And I think young people are uniquely situated to do that, to bring us through a clean energy transition and address the climate crisis, to make technology work more for us than against us. And I do think young people have the social skills to do it, honestly. And so actually the kind of problem-solving, techno-optimistic nature of the next generation should be pointed directly at the challenge of this degrading security situation and say, don't just solve it conflict by conflict, try and solve these underlying drivers with the kind of spirit of innovation and humanity that I think is present in the next generation.
On your second part of your question, look, I'm an immigrant, so I have an essentially structurally optimistic view of the United States. You know, I chose to come here, leave behind something, start a family here. You know, so I always have the sense that the United States looks much worse than it is because we wash our dirty laundry in the public. All the problems are aired and re-aired. And so what you're going through now in particular is, I think, a period of great rethinking of what the nature of American democracy is, what the nature of the American economy is, what are our relations with the rest of the world. And it's probably better to have that all aired, to have it all exposed, to in a sense, wrestle with all of it, rather than to just hope that we can keep things under control. You know, this group of people, the kind of technocratic elites who've been running things, continue to run things. Maybe this is better because you are forced to confront the opposition, the divisions, the debates. And I hope what we will come to realize is that what we have is incredibly precious. What we have is, the oldest constitutional democracy in the world. What we have is this incredible rich civil society and the innovation that the economy produces. What we have is a world that we have created since 1945 that is unlike anything before it, that has been able to transform not just the international political system, but create an international economy that has lifted maybe 500 million people out of poverty, that it has put human rights on the agenda in a way that it never has. One of the tragedies of what has happened with USAID is the United States basically invented foreign aid. This was not something that really was done before 1945. And the United States, as the victor of the greatest conflict in the world, said, we don't want reparations, we don't want revenge, we will actually spend money to build up our former enemies. I mean, to me, it all feels pretty special and unusual, and I think it would be one of the great tragedies of the world to let that all go. But maybe we have to have that conversation, and it can't just be all on authority and faith and look, it's all going to work out. At least that's my hope, because I've got 3 kids in this fight. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Jake. Thank you. I will take a look at it, promise.